The neighborhood was still wrapped in the gray hush of early morning when flashing lights broke the silence. For most of the block, it was the kind of hour when alarms hadn't yet rung, coffee makers hadn't yet gurgled, and only the first birds tested their throats. But at 5:42 a.m., the serenity shattered. Red and blue strobes bounced across windows, painting half-asleep walls with chaotic color. Car doors slammed. Radios crackled. Then came the heavy thud of boots lining the narrow walkway toward a modest two-story row house. Marcus Hayes stirred awake to the sound of his daughter whimpering in the next room. Lily was only 2 years old, and mornings usually began with her giggles, not with her frightened cries. He rolled from bed, pulling on a t-shirt, when a new sound rose above her voice, the pounding on the door. 3 sharp bangs. "Police! Open up!" The voice carried authority, but there was no patience in it. Marcus froze, staring at the door as if maybe it was part of a dream. His wife, Erica, sat up, rubbing her eyes, confusion spreading quickly across her face. She whispered, "Marcus, what's happening?" Before he could answer, the pounding came again, louder this time, rattling the frame. And then, unmistakable, the bark of a dog, sharp, eager, commanding silence. The hallway light flickered on. Erica clutched the blanket to her chest as Marcus walked toward the living room, his heartbeat slamming against his ribs. He reached for the knob, but the decision was made for him. With a crash like a thunderclap, the door burst inward. Wood splintered, hinges groaned, and suddenly their quiet home was flooded with armored officers. "Hands where I can see them," shouted the lead officer, weapon raised. Marcus' hands shot skyward, his breath catching in his throat. Erica screamed, clutching Lily as the toddler began to wail. The dog entered next, a muscular German shepherd with a glossy coat, teeth bared, and a growl that rattled Marcus' bones. At its handler's command, the dog leapt forward, nose twitching, sniffing the air like it was born for this moment. Its eyes were locked, not on Marcus, but on the corners of the house it hadn't yet explored. Neighbors were already gathering outside, peeking from behind curtains, their shadows stretching across lawns as the spectacle grew. Some filmed on their phones, whispering to one another about what Marcus must have done to deserve a raid like this. Inside, Marcus tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "What's going on? You've got the wrong house. Please, my daughter, quiet," barked another officer, shoving him against the wall and clicking cuffs around his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin. Erica's pleas went unanswered as 2 officers guided her and Lily to the sofa, warning them not to move. The handler unclipped the dog's leash. "Seek, Atlas, seek." Atlas moved like a machine wound too tight, weaving through the living room, nails scraping the floor. The officers followed in his wake, eyes scanning every corner he indicated. He darted into the kitchen, sniffing the table legs, the cabinets, the trash bin. Then suddenly he froze, ears pricked, body rigid. His tail straightened like a steel rod. He pawed once, twice, at the base of the corner cabinet and barked. "There," the handler announced, voice full of certainty. Positive alert. The officers didn't hesitate. Crowbars pried open the lower cabinet door. A flour bag toppled out, followed by stacked canned goods. Behind them, taped tightly in plastic, was a small, unmarked package. One officer held it aloft like a prize. "Bag secured." The room erupted into motion. Radios squawked updates. Cameras clicked to capture the evidence, and officers began methodically photographing every angle of the find. Marcus' chest heaved with panic. He shook his head violently. "That's not mine. I don't know what that is." "I swear," but no one listened. To them, the dog had spoken, and its language was law. Atlas sat proudly, panting, awaiting his handler's praise. He received a firm pat on the head and a treat from the pocket, as if he had just saved the day. In that moment, the entire weight of the case seemed to rest on his bark. The neighbors outside saw Marcus escorted in cuffs, head bowed, flanked by officers who looked grim and certain. Phones recorded every second as someone muttered, "Knew he was trouble. Look at that. Drugs in the house with a kid around." Another whispered, "Thank God for that dog." Sniffed it right out. Back inside, Erica clutched Lily, her face pale, her hands trembling. Marcus doesn't even. He doesn't. This isn't right. She shouted, but her words were drowned beneath the shuffle of boots and the scrawl of pens filling out seizure reports. Lily, still crying, reached for her father as he was led through the doorway. "Daddy," she cried, her small voice cutting through the din. Marcus turned once, meeting her eyes, the weight of his confusion and fear pressing harder than the cuffs themselves. In less than 15 minutes, the Hayes family home had transformed from a place of warmth into a crime scene. White evidence bags lined the kitchen table. A clipboard bore Marcus' name, tagged beside suspect. Atlas sat obediently near the door, tongue lolling, tail thumping against the floor, oblivious to the storm his alert had sparked. The final blow came as an officer read Marcus's rights. Words blurred in his ears. "Anything you say can and will be used against you," while flashes from neighbors' cameras lit the early morning haze outside. To the onlookers, it was a victory. A dangerous man, taken off the streets. A loyal police dog, celebrated once again for his instincts. But for Marcus, cuffed and shoved into the back of a squad car, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Erica sat inside, holding Lily tightly as silence crept back into the home. The door frame splintered, the floor scuffed, the cabinet half broken. And on the table, left like a wound, was the package that would unravel everything. What no one knew, not the officers, not the neighbors, not even the prosecutors waiting downtown, was that two simple words from the youngest witness in the house would soon turn this airtight case upside down. The morning after the raid, the neighborhood still hummed with gossip. What had happened inside the Hayes home was no longer just a police operation. It had become fuel for conversations at bus stops, over coffee counters, and in text messages across town. The images, Marcus in handcuffs, a barking police dog, a mysterious package, were now plastered across local news broadcasts. Police dog Atlas sniffs out drugs in neighborhood raid, one station announced with a triumphant tone, as though the German Shepherd had single-handedly cleaned the streets of crime. A grainy still from body cam footage appeared on the screen. The black package sitting on Marcus' kitchen counter. Officers crowded around it. The anchor added gravely, "One man is in custody." Authorities confirm that controlled substances were recovered. Neighbors say they're shocked, though some suspected something wasn't right at the home. Erica nearly dropped the remote. She sat stiffly on the sofa, Lily perched on her lap, half asleep with a thumb in her mouth. The house was eerily quiet now, except for the occasional creak of the broken front door, which still hung awkwardly from its splintered frame. Marcus wasn't there. He was sitting in a holding cell at the county jail, waiting for his first hearing. And for the first time in her life, Erica felt utterly invisible, like the news had erased her family's truth and replaced it with a headline. By noon, reporters were on the sidewalk, knocking on neighbors' doors, eager for quotes. One neighbor, a woman who had never spoken more than 2 words to Marcus, told the cameras, "I always thought he looked suspicious. Quiet, you know? You never know what people are hiding." Another neighbor, eager for attention, claimed, "That little girl was always crying. Makes you wonder what kind of environment she was in." The narrative took shape quickly. Marcus was painted as a criminal, his family as collateral. The public consumed the story as if it were fact. The hearing at 2 p.m., Marcus was led into a crowded courtroom, still wearing the same clothes he'd slept in before the raid. His wrists were shackled to his waist, his ankles chained together. He felt the stares of strangers digging into his skin, like judgment made flesh. The prosecutor rose confidently. "Your Honor, the defendant, Marcus Hayes, is charged with possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. The evidence includes a package recovered during a lawful search and seizure, corroborated by a trained canine alert. The defendant poses a flight risk and a danger to the community. We request he be held without bond." The judge, an older man with sharp glasses, barely looked at Marcus. "And the defense?" Marcus' attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Daniel Ross, stood. He was a compact man with thinning hair and the air of someone used to being ignored. "Your Honor, my client has no prior record, steady employment, and deep community ties. He strongly denies ownership of the alleged substance. The so-called discovery rests entirely on the signal of a police dog, which, as this court knows, is not infallible. We request a reasonable bond." The prosecutor scoffed. "Not infallible? This dog has a 98% success rate and is certified by the state. The alert is as strong as any eyewitness testimony." Marcus wanted to shout, wanted to tell the judge, the lawyers, the whole room that he had never touched that package, had no idea where it came from. But the chains and the stern bailiff's glare silenced him. The judge tapped his pen thoughtfully before ruling. "Bail is set at $50,000. The gavel struck. Erica, sitting in the back row with Lily wriggling in her lap, gasped. $50,000? They barely had enough to cover rent. The fallout. That evening, Marcus' mugshot appeared online. His eyes were tired, his expression blank, but the caption was merciless. "Man charged in narcotics case after police dog alert." The comment sections erupted. "Lock him up and throw away the key," one wrote. "Dog don't lie," another added. "Child endangerment too." Sad. By the next morning, Marcus' boss called Erica. The conversation was brief, cold, and final. "We can't have this kind of attention on the company. We'll need to terminate his employment immediately." Erica's voice broke as she asked, "Even though nothing's proven?" The boss sighed. "We can't wait for the courts. It's about reputation." 2 hours later, an eviction notice was taped to their already broken front door. The landlord didn't want criminal activity associated with the property. The walls of Marcus' life collapsed faster than he could comprehend. In less than 48 hours, he had lost his freedom, his job, and his home. The world believed in the dog's bark more than his own words. The defense's struggle Daniel Ross visited Marcus in jail later that week, carrying a thin file. He pulled up a plastic chair opposite him, sighed, and slid the folder across the table. "Here's the problem," Ross said, rubbing his temples. "The entire case hangs on the canine's alert. Courts have ruled again and again that a dog's alert is probable cause, even if no drugs are found. In your case, they claim they were found. That makes it twice as hard." Marcus clenched his fists. "But I've never seen that package in my life. They planted it, or mixed it up, or something." Ross nodded. "I believe you. But belief isn't evidence. We have to attack the chain of custody, the integrity of the search, and maybe, just maybe, the dog's training records. If Atlas has false alerts on his record, we can use that." He flipped through the file. "But right now, all the jury will see is, good dog finds drugs, bad man arrested. It's simple. Too simple." Erica's world collapses back at home. Erica tried to hold her life together. She took Lily to daycare, ignoring the whispers of other parents. She answered calls from relatives who half believed the news. She stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the eviction notice, feeling her stomach twist into knots. At night, when Lily was asleep, she scrolled through the news coverage again and again, reading every cruel comment. Each word felt like a dagger. How can they hate him without knowing him? She thought. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus' cousin. I told you he was no good. Should have left him years ago. Tears blurred her vision. A narrative takes hold. Within a week, the case was the talk of the city. Reporters called Atlas, the canine hero, running profiles on his years of training, his many successful searches. Children at local schools drew pictures of the dog with capes, calling him Detective Atlas. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in a cell, waiting for a trial date. He was no longer Marcus the father, Marcus the husband, Marcus the neighbor. He was Marcus the criminal. And the world, it seemed, preferred that story. Only Erica, clutching Lily each night, repeated the truth. He didn't do it. He didn't. But her voice was drowned out by headlines that painted her family as broken and guilty before a single piece of real evidence was tested. And so, the life Marcus had built, steady, quiet, ordinary, was appended. Not by proof. Not by witnesses. Not by anything he had done. But by a dog's bark, a bag, and a system that believed in both more than it believed in him. The story wasn't over. Not by far. The cracks were already forming, hidden beneath the surface. And soon, the smallest voice of all, a toddler's 2 words, would echo louder than every headline combined. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood polish and burnt coffee, the kind that lingered in hallways long after the pot had been emptied. On the morning of Marcus Hayes' trial, the lobby was alive with a peculiar buzz. Not quite chaos, but not quite calm either. Reporters jostled for space, their cameras already warmed up. Curious citizens, with no personal stake in the case, had drifted in after reading weeks of sensational headlines about the drug dealer, caught by hero police dog Atlas. The prosecution didn't need to work hard to frame the story. The public had already written it for them. Marcus was led into the courtroom, wearing a plain gray suit that didn't quite fit, borrowed from his cousin. His wrists bore faint marks from weeks in cuffs, though today they were free, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His eyes swept the room. Jurors filing in, a row of neighbors whispering behind him, Erica clutching Lily in the back. She gave him the smallest nod, the kind that meant we're still here, still fighting. Judge Thompson entered, tall, severe, with spectacles that slid dangerously close to the tip of his nose. All rise. The ritual began. Opening moves, the prosecutor, Miss Callahan, strode confidently to the jury box. She was polished, sharp, and precise, the kind of lawyer who never misplaced a paperclip. Her voice rang clear. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a simple case. On the morning of April 12th, officers executed a lawful search warrant on the home of Marcus Hayes. Accompanied by a highly trained canine officer, Atlas, they uncovered a package of controlled substances hidden inside a cabinet. The defendant lived in that home. The drugs were in his kitchen. His toddler daughter was there. This is not speculation. This is fact. At the end of this trial, you will return one verdict, guilty. Her words were clean cuts, delivered with the precision of a surgeon. The jurors nodded subtly, impressed by her confidence. Then came the defense. Daniel Ross adjusted his tie, which was perpetually a little crooked, and approached the jury. He wasn't flashy. His voice lacked Callahan's booming resonance. But his words carried weight, quiet, and deliberate. This case, ladies and gentlemen, is not as simple as the state would like you to believe. Yes, a package was found. But whose package was it? Where did it come from? And how, exactly, did it end up in Mr. Hayes' cabinet? You will see gaps in the evidence, missing log entries, inconsistencies in the body cam footage, and unanswered questions about the chain of custody. And let us not forget, dogs, though loyal and remarkable, are not perfect. Atlas cannot testify. He cannot be cross-examined. But people can. And when we examine the people who handled this case, you will see that the truth is not as clear as the prosecution suggests. A few jurors exchanged curious glances. Erica felt a flicker of hope. Atlas takes the stage. The highlight of the morning came when the bailiff opened a side door, and in walked Atlas, the German shepherd whose name had become synonymous with the case. His handler, Officer Jenkins, held the leash firmly as the dog padded forward, nails clicking against the polished floor. Atlas' coat gleamed, his posture proud, his gaze alert. Jurors smiled instinctively. Even in a courtroom where lives were weighed, a dog could note suspicion. Officer Jenkins testified with a soldier's discipline. He spoke of Atlas training, of countless successful alerts, of certifications and tests passed with flying colors. He described the raid with clarity. Atlas entered, sniffed, and immediately indicated the cabinet. He was consistent. His behavior was unmistakable. That's how we knew to look. Prosecutor Callahan reinforced the narrative. Would you say Atlas is reliable? Absolutely. One of the best I've handled. And in your professional opinion, did Atlas alert to the presence of narcotics in Mr. Hayes' kitchen? Yes, ma'am. Without question. The jurors leaned forward, captivated not only by the testimony, but by the sight of the dog himself, sitting calmly, panting lightly, tail wagging every so often. He was more than evidence. He was a symbol. And symbols were powerful. Ross rose for cross-examination. He approached slowly, hands folded behind his back. Officer Jenkins, thank you for your service. Now, tell me, has Atlas ever given a false alert? Jenkins stiffened. Not that I recall. Ross pressed. Never once? Not a single time in training or in the field? Jenkins hesitated. Dogs are living beings. There's always a margin. But his record speaks for itself. Ross nodded, feigning agreement. A margin. Exactly. Isn't it true that courts across the country have debated the reliability of canine alerts? Some have, yes. And isn't it also true, officer, that Atlas cannot tell this jury in his own words what he smelled, when he smelled it, or why? Jenkins' jaw tightened. He communicates through behavior. That's the method of his training? Ross turned to the jury. Behavior, interpreted by a human. And humans, as we know, can make mistakes. The moment lingered. A seed of doubt, small but visible, had been planted. The evidence next came the physical proof. The black bag sealed in plastic, labeled, tagged, and presented with the ceremonial gravity of a holy relic. Officers described its discovery, the photographs taken, the lab report confirming narcotics. The bag was placed on a table in full view of the jury. Its very presence carried weight. Something tangible, something undeniable. Callahan's voice rang with certainty. This is the defendant's bag. It was found in his home. The drugs were inside. The evidence is clear. Ross rose again. Ladies and gentlemen, you will notice something curious about this evidence. The chain of custody, the record of who handled this bag and when, has gaps. Minutes unaccounted for. Paperwork filed late. Officers contradicting each other's recollections. You will also notice that the body cam footage presented has cuts. Why? Why should a supposedly airtight case have so many holes? We will explore these questions. The jurors shifted uneasily. They wanted clarity, not puzzles. But Ross knew that uncertainty was his greatest weapon. Marcus on display throughout it all. Marcus sat silently at the defense table, trying not to fidget, trying not to appear guilty simply for existing. He could feel eyes drilling into him. Jurors, reporters, strangers who had read his name in bold print. Every cough, every nervous glance, every whispered exchange with Ross seemed magnified. He wanted to shout, "I didn't do this. I don't even know what that bag is. Believe me." But the courtroom was not built for shouting. It was built for ritual, for procedure, for a slow dance of words and evidence where emotion was stripped bare. Erica, from the back row, squeezed Lily's hand and prayed silently. The ritual continues. Witnesses were sworn in. Objections were raised and sustained. Documents were passed around like sacred texts. The courtroom rhythm was mechanical, almost theatrical, each participant playing a role. The jury scribbled notes, the judge frowned thoughtfully, and the attorneys sparred with rehearsed precision. But beneath the polished surface, tension rippled. The defense had raised questions, small, fragile questions, and jurors could not ignore them. As the day closed, Judge Thompson dismissed the court. "We reconvene tomorrow at 9 sharp. Marcus was led out by deputies. Shoulders slumped, but Erica caught his eye and mouthed, "Hold on." The stage is set outside. Reporters swarmed Callan, microphones thrust in her face. "How confident are you about the outcome?" "Very confident," she said smoothly. "The evidence speaks for itself." Ross, asked the same question, gave a tired smile. "The truth isn't always as neat as it looks." The sun dipped below the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps. Atlas was led back to his kennel, oblivious to the headlines that crowned him a hero once again. The trial was only beginning, but already it felt like a battle between symbols, the certainty of a dog's bark against the uncertainty of human error. What no one knew, not yet, was that clarity would not come from polished lawyers, from officers, or from judges. It would come from the smallest voice in the room. And when that voice spoke, everything would change. The courthouse was built to intimidate. Its marble steps rose steep and wide, its pillars loomed, and its halls echoed with the footsteps of the countless accused who had shuffled through them. Inside courtroom 3B, the air was dry and tense, heavy with the smell of polished wood and paper. It was the third day of testimony in State v. Hayes, and the trial had settled into a rhythm. Prosecutors presenting their polished story, defense counsel tugging at loose threads, jurors trying to stitch it all together in their minds. Marcus sat quietly at the defense table, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. He had learned by now that every twitch, every sigh, every glance was noticed by someone, a juror, a reporter, the judge. Better to appear calm, collected, even if inside he was unraveling. Behind him, Erica sat with Lily in her lap. The toddler squirmed restlessly, kicking her tiny sneakers against the wooden bench. Courtrooms were no place for children, but Erica had no choice. She couldn't afford full-time care, and she refused to leave her daughter with neighbors who whispered behind her back. Lily's presence was both a burden and a lifeline. The child kept Erica grounded, even as her husband's future hung by a thread. The morning session had been dense with testimony, evidence technicians droning about procedure, prosecutors displaying photos of the black bag found in Marcus' kitchen cabinet, defense attorney Ross probing for inconsistencies. The jurors were attentive, but fatigue showed in their faces. Eyes glazed, pens tapped. At last, Judge Thompson glanced at the clock. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." A collective sigh of relief swept the room. The jurors filed out, stretching their legs. Reporters whispered into phones, relaying updates. Lawyers shuffled papers, preparing for the next round. And in that lull, in that seemingly insignificant slice of time, the case would be turned upside down. The toddler Wander's Erica stood, adjusting Lily on her hip. "Come on, baby, let's stretch," she whispered, stepping into the aisle. Lily squirmed to the ground, eager to explore. Her little feet pattered against the polished floor as she toddled forward, ignoring her mother's outstretched hand. The evidence table stood at the front of the courtroom, near the jury box. On it lay the sealed black bag. The package prosecutors claimed contained drugs. It was displayed like a trophy, a physical reminder to jurors of what this case was supposedly about. Lily's eyes fixed on it. Something about the object caught her attention, the way bright colors lure children in toy aisles. She waddled toward the table, small arms swinging, and pointed. "Blue backpack," she said, her voice clear and high. The words carried across the emptying courtroom, bouncing off walls, cutting through the low hum of conversation. For a moment, silence followed. Then a ripple spread. A juror who hadn't yet left the room paused in the doorway, turning his head. A court reporter glanced up from her machine. Daniel Ross froze mid-sentence, a file still in his hand. "Blue backpack," Lily repeated, insistent now, as if correcting a mistake no one else seemed to notice. The silence that followed Erica rushed forward, scooping Lily into her arms. "She, baby, she," she whispered, embarrassed. But the damage, or perhaps the miracle, was already done. Ross's lawyer's mind spun. His eyes darted from the black bag on the table to Erica, then to the lingering jurors who had heard every word. The evidence displayed in front of them was not blue. It was unmistakably black. Yet Lily, barely 2 years old, spoke with the unfiltered honesty of a child. Ross approached Erica gently. "What did she just say?" Erica's cheeks flushed. She's just a baby. She says things." "No," Ross said firmly, his voice low. "She noticed something." "What color is Lily's backpack at home?" "Blue," Erica whispered. Ross's pulse quickened. He glanced again at the black evidence bag, then at the jurors whispering among themselves. Something was wrong. Something in the chain of evidence had shifted, and it was the smallest witness in the room who had pointed it out. Seeds of doubt. When the session resumed, the courtroom was not the same. Jurors returned to their seats, but a current of curiosity buzzed among them. A few stole glances at the evidence bag, then at Lily, who now dozed against Erica's shoulder, thumb in mouth, unaware of the stir she had caused. Ross stood to cross-examine the state's evidence technician, his questions sharper than before. "You testified that this bag, here in court, is the same one recovered from Mr. Hayes' kitchen, correct?" "Yes," the technician said, adjusting his glasses. "And you are absolutely certain of that?" "Of course. It's tagged, logged, and sealed." Ross walked slowly toward the table, gesturing to the black bag. "Tell me, sir, when you filled out the initial evidence log, did you describe the item's color?" The technician frowned. I believe so." Ross flipped open a document. "You did. And what does it say?" A pause. Then, blue. The courtroom stirred. Jurors leaned forward. Ross's voice grew firmer. "So help me understand. If your log describes a blue backpack, why is the bag in front of us black?" The technician stammered, searching for an explanation. It may have been an error. Ink smudge, mislabeling, or perhaps," Ross interrupted, "the bag in front of us is not the same one logged that morning." Callahan shot to her feet. "Objection. Speculation." Judge Thompson frowned, but the doubt was already seated. The jurors' eyes flicked between the black bag and the technician, their skepticism palpable. The prosecutor's scramble, Callahan tried to recover, redirecting with stern questions, re-establishing the chain of custody. But the jurors no longer listened with blind acceptance. The toddler's innocent observation had cracked the facade. If a 2-year-old could spot a discrepancy, what else had been missed? Callahan's voice grew sharper, more defensive. She emphasized Atlas Alert, the photos from the raid, the lab results. Yet her once seamless narrative now had a fracture running through it. The blue versus black contradiction lingered, like a stain she could not scrub away. Marcus' flicker of hope. For the first time since the raid, Marcus felt something stir in his chest. Hope. He replayed Lily's voice in his head. Blue backpack. 2 words. 2 tiny words that no lawyer, no officer, no journalist could have crafted. She wasn't testifying. She wasn't strategizing. She was just speaking truth the way children do, unfiltered, uncoached. He glanced at Erica, who looked equal parts mortified and stunned. He mouthed, "Thank you." She blinked back tears. The jurors whispered that night. As jurors left the courthouse, conversations buzzed among them. They weren't supposed to discuss the case outside deliberations, but human nature tugged at the edges. "Did you hear the kid?" One murmured to another in the parking lot. "Clear as day," came the reply. "And the log said blue." "That bag's black." The questions grew. If the evidence bag wasn't the same, what else had been mishandled? Could the prosecution's airtight case actually be flawed? The smallest witness the next morning. Newspapers focused on the dramatic cross-examination, but whispers spread about the toddler's words. One columnist wrote, "Sometimes truth emerges from unexpected mouths." A child in the Hayes trial noticed what no one else did, a detail that could unravel the case. Atlas, once the star of the show, now shared the spotlight with Lily, the tiny witness. The story had shifted. And once public perception shifted, it was difficult to turn back. 2 words that changed everything in courtroom 3B. The evidence bag still sat on the table, as black as ever. But now it carried more than drugs inside. It carried doubt. Doubt planted by the smallest voice in the room, a child too young to know the weight of her words. Blue backpack. 2 words. Simple, innocent, yet powerful enough to rattle the very foundation of the case. The courtroom ritual would continue, but it would never be the same again. The morning after Lily's innocent declaration, the courthouse felt different. Reporters gathered in thicker clusters at the entrance, whispering about the toddler's testimony. Courtroom 3B was unusually crowded. Strangers squeezed into benches, curious to see if the child's 2 words, blue backpack, would actually amount to anything. Inside, the air vibrated with a quiet tension. Marcus sat straighter than usual at the defense table. For weeks he had slumped under the weight of accusations, but now there was a flicker in his eyes. Beside him, Attorney Daniel Ross organized his papers with an energy that surprised even Erica. He had been defending Marcus fiercely all along, but now he looked like a man on the scent of something deeper. The blue versus black contradiction was no longer just a toddler's mistake or coincidence. Ross had spent half the night poring over every photograph, every evidence log, every lab sheet he could obtain. What he found disturbed him. Inconsistencies so small that most lawyers might have overlooked them, yet big enough to shift the entire narrative. The photograph problem. Ross began the day by calling for admission of the raid photographs into evidence. Prosecutor Callahan tried to object, claiming they were already on file, but Ross pressed until Judge Thompson relented. Large screens flickered on. Images filled the courtroom. The Hayes kitchen at dawn, cabinets hanging open, drawers yanked out, officers in latex gloves. Atlas, the canine, appeared frozen mid-bark in one frame. But Ross directed everyone's attention to one photograph in particular. It showed a backpack sitting on the kitchen counter. The lighting was poor, but the color was clear. A bright, scuffed blue. Ross let the jurors study it before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the photo taken at the scene. You can see the backpack here, yes?" Heads nodded. Ross walked toward the evidence table, resting his hand on the sealed black bag prosecutors had displayed since day one. "And this is the backpack currently before you in court. Black, identified in the logbook as blue, displayed in photos as blue. But somehow, Somewhere between that morning raid and today's trial, it transformed into black. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Callahan rose sharply. Objection. Defense is mischaracterizing evidence. Lighting can distort. Lighting cannot change blue to black, Ross snapped. Unless the laws of physics have changed overnight. Judge Thompson banged his gavel. Enough. Sit down. The jury will determine what they see. Ross smiled faintly. The seed of doubt, once planted, was now watered. The chain of custody cracks. Ross wasn't done. He called the evidence clerk to the stand, a middle-aged man named Howard Reeves, who looked distinctly uncomfortable under the fluorescent lights. Reeves adjusted his tie, clearing his throat too often. Ross began gently. Mr. Reeves, your job is to log and secure evidence after it's collected, correct? Yes. And accuracy is crucial in this process? Of course. Ross handed him the intake form. This is your handwriting? Yes. Please read the description of the item. Reeves squinted. Blue backpack, nylon zipper, broken on right side. Ross turned to the jury. Blue backpack. Not black. Blue. Reeves shifted in his seat. It's possible the officer mislabeled it when bringing it in. Ross pounced. So either the officer mislabeled it, or you mishandled it. Which is it? Callahan jumped up. Objection. Sustained, Judge Thompson said, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard the options, and neither inspired confidence. The handler under fire next came Officer Gregson, Atlas handler. He had testified earlier with an air of confidence, proud of his dog's performance. But now Ross pushed him harder. Officer, when Atlas alerted to the cabinet, was there any recording device capturing the search? Gregson hesitated. There should have been, or was. There was a body cam. Yes, Ross raised an eyebrow. And yet the footage provided by the state cuts off 5 minutes before the backpack is shown. Care to explain? Gregson squirmed. Technical malfunction. Ross held up a DVD. A malfunction. That just so happened to occur during the most critical moment of the raid, when the alleged drugs were found. The jurors whispered among themselves. A malfunction at the exact moment of discovery seemed far too convenient. The lab tests tangled as the day continued. Ross called a forensic chemist from the state lab. Her testimony, too, was shaky. Ma'am, Ross began, the bag you tested was logged as blue, correct? Yes. But the bag in front of you now, black, that's not the one you tested? Well, the contents were consistent, Ross cut in. Consistent is not identical. You cannot swear under oath that the contents you tested came from the bag in this courtroom. The chemist faltered. No, I cannot. Murmurs erupted. Jurors leaned forward. Ross' voice rose. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't a small error. This is the state presenting one bag to the lab, another bag to this courtroom, and asking you to trust they're the same without proof. That is not justice. That is sloppiness at best, fraud at worst. Callahan barked. Objection. But her tone lacked the sharpness it once carried. The prosecution was bleeding credibility. Erica's quiet strength through it all. Erica sat gripping Lily's small hand. She had dreaded bringing her daughter into this trial, but now she realized that Lily had been the catalyst. Her innocent words had opened doors seasoned lawyers had overlooked. When recess was called, Erica whispered to Marcus, "She saved you, didn't she?" Marcus nodded, eyes shining. She saw what no one else wanted to see. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine walking free. The jury's shift by the afternoon, the jurors' body language had changed. Where once they leaned toward Callahan's polished arguments, now they leaned toward Ross. They scribbled more notes during defense questioning than prosecution. Some frowned openly at the state's witnesses. One juror whispered to another, "If they can't even keep the bag straight, How can we trust anything else? Callahan's unraveling. Prosecutor Callahan, once confident, was unraveling. She objected too often, her voice rising in frustration. She snapped at witnesses who hesitated. She tried to redirect attention to Atlas, to the supposed drugs, to Marcus' financial troubles. But the jurors weren't looking at Marcus anymore. They were looking at the state, wondering how such basic mistakes could happen. The star witness had become not Atlas, the police dog, nor the officers, nor even Marcus himself. It was Lily, the toddler who had spoken truth without agenda. The boxes reopened late that afternoon. Ross made one more request. Your Honor, in light of these discrepancies, I move for the physical re-examination of all evidence boxes logged during the raid, not just the bag in question. Callahan protested, but Judge Thompson, his patience fraying, granted the motion. Clerks wheeled in cardboard boxes sealed with evidence tape. One by one, Ross demanded they be opened and checked, and what they found was worse than sloppy bookkeeping. Dates mismatched. Items were mislabeled. A scale was logged twice, as if entered on 2 different days. A small baggie of powder had no signature confirming who collected it. The jurors' faces hardened with each revelation. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This was about a system that looked careless, maybe even corrupt. The atmosphere shifts. By the end of the day, the case felt transformed. The polished narrative of a guilty man caught by a heroic dog was collapsing. In its place stood a story of doubt, mishandled evidence, and sloppy procedure, all because a toddler pointed at a bag and said 2 simple words. Marcus' private vow that night. As Marcus sat in his cell awaiting transport back to jail, he whispered a vow to himself. If I walk free, I'll never take another day with them for granted. Erica, Lily, they saved me. In the dim light, he smiled for the first time in months. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he believed he might win. The 6th day of trial began under stormy skies. Rain hammered the courthouse steps. Umbrellas collided as reporters scrambled for cover, and the wet air carried a sense of brewing chaos. Inside courtroom 3B, that chaos would take shape in words, questions, and silences. The kind of silences that sink deeper than any shout. Marcus entered with a straighter back than in weeks past. His orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced by a borrowed suit that hung awkwardly on his frame, but gave him the dignity he had long been denied. Erica and little Lily sat quietly behind him, the child clutching her worn teddy bear. Defense attorney Daniel Ross looked sharper than ever, his suit pressed, his notes color-coded, his eyes alive with the kind of energy that comes when a lawyer smells blood in the water. The toddler's words had cracked the case open. Now it was his job to widen that crack into a canyon. Prosecutor Callahan, on the other hand, looked brittle. Her tone had grown clipped, her once sure gait slower. She carried the weight of a case slipping from her grasp, though she fought to mask it with her trademark steel. The gallery was packed. Reporters filled every bench, laptops at the ready. Citizens curious about the trial the toddler changed, squeezed into corners. Everyone sensed the climax was near. The handler on the stand, Ross, wasted no time calling Officer Gregson, Atlas handler, back to the stand. Gregson sat stiffly, his canine badge gleaming under the lights. For days he had been the state's golden boy, but now his confidence was threadbare. Ross began calmly. Officer, you testified earlier that Atlas alerted to the cabinet where the backpack was found. Is that correct? Yes. And Atlas has undergone training to detect narcotics? Yes. Training certified? Gregson hesitated. Yes, but certifications lapse in... Thank you, Ross interrupted smoothly, eyes flicking to the jury. So, at the time of the raid, Atlas certification had, in fact, lapsed? Gregson shifted. Technically, yes, but he was scheduled for renewal. The jurors stirred. A dog once painted as flawless was now presented as fallible. Ross pressed further. And isn't it true that dogs like Atlas can sometimes respond to handler cues, subconscious gestures, body language, rather than actual sense? Callahan objected. Speculation. Ross held up a thick folder. Scientific studies, peer-reviewed, Your Honor. I'll happily read excerpts. The judge allowed it. Ross quoted research about cueing, where handlers unintentionally guide dogs to alert where officers expect contraband. Jurors leaned forward, intrigued. Gregson's jaw tightened. Atlas doesn't false alert, Ross smiled thinly. And yet, without certification, without video of the alert, without an unbroken chain of custody, you're asking this jury to trust your word, and yours alone, that he did. Gregson's face flushed. Silence stretched. The jurors' doubt deepened. The body cam footage next. Ross turned to the missing footage. He walked slowly before the jury, holding up a disc. This is the state's body cam submission. You've seen parts of it. But notice, it ends 5 minutes before the supposed discovery of the bag. Officer Gregson, can you explain why? Gregson muttered, battery issue. Ross pounced. A battery issue that occurred at the exact moment of critical evidence recovery. That's convenient. Callahan jumped up. Objection, argumentative. Sustained, the judge barked, but the point was made. Jurors exchanged looks. Ross didn't need to belabor it. The seed of suspicion had sprouted. The clerk cornered Ross, then called Howard Reeves, the evidence clerk, back for further questioning. Reeves looked more haggard than the day before. His hands trembled slightly as he raised his right hand to take the oath. Mr. Reeves, Ross began, yesterday you admitted the intake form described the item as a blue backpack. Yet the bag before us is black. Have you since located any paperwork correcting this discrepancy? Reeves swallowed. No. Did you, at any time, handle 2 separate backpacks? No, Ross paced. So we are left with 2 possibilities. Either the log is false, or the bag is wrong. Which is it? Reeves stammered. I can't say. Ross turned dramatically toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the state's own custodian of evidence cannot tell you whether the bag in front of you is the bag collected from my client's home. Reeves shrank in his chair. Callahan rubbed her temples. The jury scribbled furiously. The chemist unraveled Ross. Wasn't done. The forensic chemist who had analyzed the alleged drugs was next. She was a precise woman in her 40s, her glasses perched low on her nose, her manner brisk. Ross softened his voice. Doctor, you tested the powder submitted, correct? Yes. And the bag described in the lab report was blue? Yes, that's what the paperwork said. Ross gestured to the evidence table. And the bag here today is black. Can you swear, under oath, that the substance you tested came from this specific bag? She hesitated. I can only swear it came from what was submitted to me. Ross leaned in. So you cannot link the drugs you tested directly to Mr. Hayes' home. Correct? Her lips thinned. Correct. The room buzzed. Jurors looked stunned. The link between Marcus and the drugs, the very heart of the state's case, had just been severed. Callahan's crumbling walls, Prosecutor Callahan, rose for redirect, but her words came out sharp, defensive. She tried to remind the jury of Atlas' reputation, the raid's photographs, Marcus' finances. But the confidence was gone. Her narrative no longer flowed. It stumbled. Ross objected twice, and both objections were sustained. By the time Callahan sat down, her jaw was tight, her eyes glassy with suppressed frustration. The jurors' faces, Ross had always been trained never to read too much into juror expressions. But now he couldn't help it. He saw their narrowed eyes, their furrowed brows, their skeptical stares directed not at Marcus, but at the state's table. They whispered among themselves during pauses. One even shook her head as the chemist admitted she couldn't link the drugs to the black bag. For the first time, Marcus wasn't the one on trial. The system was. Erica's quiet tears from the gallery. Erica watched with her heart in her throat. She squeezed Lily's hand so tightly, the toddler wriggled in protest. Tears filled Erica's eyes as she realized what was happening. The tide had turned. For months, she had endured whispers, eviction, job loss, humiliation. But now, because of her daughter's 2 words, and Ross' relentless unraveling of the state's case, truth was clawing its way into the light. She leaned down and kissed Lily's hair. "You did this," she whispered. Lily just giggled, oblivious. The judge's patience wears thin by late afternoon. Judge Thompson's patience with the prosecution was visibly fraying. He snapped at Callahan for fumbling with exhibits. He glared at Reeves when the clerk stumbled over answers. He banged his gavel harder than necessary. Finally, as Ross wrapped up with a dramatic line, "If the state cannot prove the bag is the same, they cannot prove the crime." Judge Thompson announced a recess with unusual haste. The jurors filed out, their faces unreadable, but their glances lingered on Marcus longer than before. Not with disdain, with doubt, with something close to pity. Marcus' quiet realization as the guards led Marcus back to holding. He whispered to Ross, "You believe we're going to win, don't you?" Ross didn't answer directly. He just smiled faintly and said, "They've built their case on sand, Marcus. And today we showed the tide is coming in." For the first time since the dawn raid that tore his world apart, Marcus felt something unfamiliar swell in his chest, the belief that he might walk free. The crack becomes a canyon that night. Headlines screamed, "Defense tears holes in state's case. Blue bag versus black bag mystery deepens." Commentators debated the reliability of canine alerts, the dangers of mishandled evidence, the implications for every other case hinging on the same officers. The public, once quick to condemn Marcus, now began to question the police, the prosecutors, even the justice system itself. In living rooms across the city, people repeated the story of the toddler in court, the child, whose 2 words had exposed cracks the adults had ignored. And in courtroom 3B, those cracks were no longer cracks. They were canyons swallowing the state's case whole. The courtroom felt charged, like a storm ready to break. Word of the defense's revelations, the blue backpack, the faulty chain of custody, Atlas lapsed certification, the missing body cam footage had rippled through the jurors' minds and the public alike. By the 7th day, the air inside courtroom 3B was thick with expectation, skepticism, and a hint of vindication. Marcus Hayes, once the accused in what seemed an airtight case, now felt the tides of fortune shifting beneath him. He sat at the defense table, shoulders straighter than ever, hands folded. Erica, holding Lily on her lap, whispered reassurances, but the weight of months of fear and uncertainty still pressed on him. The courtroom had transformed into a battleground, where facts, evidence, and human error collided. And standing at the center of it all was a legal storm, poised to break. Prosecution under siege. Prosecutor Callahan rose to call her next witness, a senior officer present during the raid. But Ross had anticipated her move. His strategy was simple yet devastating. Dismantle credibility piece by piece. Every officer, every piece of evidence, every testimony could be questioned, and Ross executed it with meticulous precision. "Officer Patel," Ross began during cross-examination, "you were present during the cataloging of evidence, correct?" "Yes," Patel replied, a hint of unease in his tone. "And you verified the contents of the package before it was submitted to the lab?" "Yes." Ross held up the intake log. "This document describes a blue backpack. Is that consistent with what you recall at the time?" Patel hesitated. "Yes." But the bag was dark in color, maybe navy? Ross nodded. So the description conflicts with the physical evidence? Yes. The words hung in the air like a guillotine's blade. Jurors shifted in their seats, their brows furrowed in doubt. Ross didn't need to shout. The room itself seemed to acknowledge the collapse of certainty. Callahan interjected, her voice sharp. Objection. Speculation. Judge Thompson raised a hand, his face tight. Sustained, but proceed carefully, counsel. Even as the judge ruled, the narrative had shifted. The aura of infallibility surrounding the raid and the K-9 unit had begun to crumble. Atlas Authority questioned Ross, then returned to Officer Gregson and Atlas, the dog who had once been the symbol of unassailable authority. Officer Gregson, Ross began. You've trained Atlas for years, yes? Yes. And yet, yesterday we learned that his certification had lapsed at the time of the search? Gregson swallowed. Technically, yes, but it was in the process of renewal, meaning Atlas had no current certification. Yes, and no video exists confirming the dog's alert at the precise moment of discovery? Gregson's lips tightened. No, meaning, Ross said quietly, but deliberately loud enough for the jury. The state asks you to trust a dog's alert without verification, without corroboration, without procedural confirmation. You ask them to trust. Faith over fact. A murmur ran through the gallery. Atlas, once heralded as the hero of the case, now sat quietly by the officer's side, a passive participant in the unraveling of his own legend. The laboratory cracks. The lab technician returned to clarify her earlier testimony. Ross approached gently. Doctor, you tested a sample from a package described as blue, correct? Yes. And this is the bag presented in court today? The chemist shook her head. It is black. Can you swear that the sample you tested came from this black bag? No. The courtroom went silent. Even the jurors, instructed to remain impartial, exchanged glances of disbelief. How could an entire prosecution hinge on a link that didn't exist? Callahan interjected frantically. Objection. Relevance. Overruled, Judge Thompson said firmly, eyes narrowing. The truth had weight in this courtroom, and the judge could feel it pressing against the structured confines of procedure. Re-examining the evidence, Ross then requested that all evidence boxes be reopened. Clerks brought in the cardboard containers, carefully sealed, one by one. Jurors watched as the contents were methodically catalogued under Ross scrutiny. Errors leapt out, mislabeled items, missing signatures, duplicate entries, even a small baggie whose origin could not be verified. Each box opened revealed a system more chaotic than corrupt, yet the impact was identical. Doubt was now undeniable. Ross turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't about a dog, or a raid, or even a suspect. This is about a system that must be held accountable. You are tasked with judging a man based on evidence that cannot be trusted. And the law does not permit that. Do not convict, because the state hopes you will overlook their errors. The gallery was silent. Even Callahan looked momentarily defeated. The media frenzy outside the courthouse. Reporters were already texting updates. The story had changed from K-9 hero nabs criminal to prosecution's case crumbles under scrutiny. Headlines blared the toddler's words. 2-year-old's observation exposes evidence. Mishandling in Hayes' case. Social media amplified the narrative. Clips of Ross questioning the chemist went viral. Photos of the evidence boxes circulating online. The public began to question the justice system itself, demanding accountability and transparency. Inside, Marcus felt a strange sense of surreal calm. He had spent months in fear, yet now the same system that had seemed insurmountable was bending under scrutiny. Erica, seated behind him, whispered, "It's working. You might actually get out of this." Marcus smiled faintly, holding her hand. We still have to finish it. But yes, it's working. The turning point. As the day progressed, jurors' expressions hardened. Where once they leaned forward eagerly at Callahan's confident narrative, they now leaned toward Ross, absorbing every nuance, every contradiction. They whispered among themselves during breaks, questioning the once trusted officers, the evidence logs, and even the dog that had been portrayed as flawless. Judge Thompson, observing this subtle shift, called for a recess. Even he could sense the prosecution's case was fraying at the edges. During the break, Marcus sat quietly, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The dawn raid, the terrifying flash of lights, the barking dog, the invasive search. And yet, despite the fear and injustice, it had taken a toddler's innocent observation to spark the truth. Two simple words, blue backpack, had begun to dismantle a system that assumed certainty without question. Callahan's desperation. The prosecution returned for the afternoon session with renewed energy, but desperation colored every word. Callahan tried to refocus the jury on Marcus' finances, on his supposed connections, on Atlas Alert. Yet each argument fell flat against the wave of doubt Ross had generated. Even the jurors' glances were telling. Skepticism, scrutiny, critical thinking. They were no longer passive observers. They were now active evaluators, weighing inconsistencies and contradictions more heavily than the prosecution's confident narrative. A moment of reflection. By the end of the day, the courtroom had transformed. Where once there had been certainty, there was ambiguity. Where once there had been fear, there was cautious optimism. And in the quiet moments between witnesses, Marcus caught Erica's eye. She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. Lily, oblivious, played with her teddy bear. For Marcus, the gravity of what had happened finally settled in. His life had been upended by a raid he did not deserve. But now, with evidence mishandled and credibility questioned, justice seemed within reach. The dawning realization. The day closed with the judge calling for the final recess before closing arguments. Jurors left, faces thoughtful, whispering among themselves. Reporters filed into the hallways, phones already capturing post-trial commentary. Marcus sat quietly, a rare smile forming. He whispered to Erica, "The tide has turned. Tomorrow, we finish this." Erica squeezed his hand, a tear sliding down her cheek. "Thanks to her," she said softly, nodding at Lily. The courtroom, once a place of dread, now felt like a theater of truth. And in the midst of it all, a toddler's 2 words had proven more powerful than any lawyer, any officer, or any headline. Marcus Hayes' fall had been halted. The reckoning had begun. The morning sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long golden beams across the polished wood of courtroom 3B. It was the 8th day of the trial, the day that would decide Marcus Hayes' fate. The atmosphere was thick with tension, anticipation, and a strange sense of closure yet to be revealed. Every person in the room sensed that history was in the making. Marcus sat at the defense table, shoulders squared, hands folded. For the first time in weeks, he felt almost calm. The courtroom had been through storms of testimony, cross-examinations, and revelations, but he was still here. Erica sat behind him with Lily nestled in her lap, holding her daughter's tiny hand, as if both of them were anchors against the uncertainty of what was to come. The jurors filed in, faces somber, pens poised, minds visibly focused. Reporters whispered into recorders. Cameras were strategically positioned, and the Judge Thompson entered with the gravity of a man who knew the weight of his words could change lives. "Everyone rise," he intoned, and the ritual of court resumed. Closing arguments, Prosecutor Callahan approached first. Her voice was steady, but there was a tension that hadn't been there on the first day. She recapped the evidence: the raid, Atlas Alert, the black bag, and the lab results. She tried to reassert confidence in her narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is simple. Drugs were found in Mr. Hayes' home. A trained police dog indicated their presence. Forensic analysis confirmed the substance. The facts are clear. We ask you to return the only verdict consistent with justice. Guilty." Her words landed with less weight than before. The jurors' pens hovered over their notes, but their eyes darted to the defense table more than the prosecutor. Then it was Ross' turn. He rose, carrying the quiet intensity of a man whose argument had been years in preparation, and whose strategy had unfolded flawlessly over the past week. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began softly, "justice is not about rushing to judgment. It is not about accepting appearances over reality. This case has been presented as clear, simple, and airtight. But we have uncovered flaws, small at first, then undeniable. A blue backpack, mislogged, mishandled, missing footage, lapsed certification. Errors that no child should have had to point out to adults. But they did." He let the words linger, watching as jurors scribbled, nodded, and leaned forward. "This is not about whether Marcus Hayes is likable or unlikable. This is not about conjecture or emotion. This is about proof. And the state has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Marcus Hayes committed any crime. Any reasonable person reviewing the evidence would see that the system itself failed him. Do not let assumption, hope, or reputation dictate your verdict. Look at the facts. Judge the evidence. Return justice." The courtroom was silent, as if holding its breath. Even Judge Thompson leaned back slightly, considering. The jury deliberates. Once closing arguments concluded, the jurors filed out to deliberate. The hallways of the courthouse buzzed with reporters speculating about the outcome, while Erica whispered encouragement to Marcus. "You've done it," she said softly, though the jury's decision still loomed. Lily tugged on Erica's sleeve. "Mommy, blue backpack," she said, oblivious to the tension that hung over the room like a cloud. Erica smiled, hugging her daughter, feeling a surge of gratitude. Without Lily, they might never have uncovered the flaws that now defined the trial. The courtroom waited in near silence for over an hour. Then, too, conversations between deputies and clerks were muted, punctuated by the occasional murmur of reporters. Every tick of the clock seemed amplified. Finally, the jury returned, filing in slowly, faces unreadable. Their foreperson, a woman in her 40s with glasses, perched low on her nose, held the note containing their verdict tightly. The verdict Judge Thompson stood. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson nodded. "We have, Your Honor. Please read it." The foreperson cleared her throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant Marcus Hayes not guilty on all charges." A murmur rose from the gallery. Relief, disbelief, and joy intertwined into a palpable wave. Marcus sank slightly in his chair, overwhelmed. Erica's hand shot to her mouth as tears spilled freely. She hugged Lily, who giggled, seemingly understanding that something monumental had just happened. Marcus turned slowly toward Ross. We won?" His voice was hoarse, disbelief mixed with awe. Ross nodded, eyes glistening slightly. "Yes, Marcus. You're free." The emotional release as the judge dismissed the court. Marcus rose, trembling. Erica rushed to his side. They embraced, tears mingling, while Lily, tiny and oblivious, tugged at Marcus' sleeve and said once again, "Blue backpack." The courtroom erupted quietly. Reporters scrambled for statements. Deputies maintained order, but for Marcus and Erica, the world had condensed into that small circle of family, tears and laughter. Atlas, the once heroic police dog, was led out by his handler, oblivious to the verdict, unaware that the tide of justice had shifted under his paws. Outside the courthouse, the press clamored for interviews. Crowds had gathered, curious citizens following the news of a trial turned on its head by a toddler. People whispered about how 2 words had changed everything, about the importance of careful evidence handling, about the fragility of justice when human error intervened. Marcus and Erica, hand in hand, stepped down the courthouse steps into a drizzle that now felt cleansing rather than oppressive. Lily skipped ahead, pointing at the black and blue evidence bag still displayed for photos, oblivious to the world-altering impact of her words. A reporter called out, "Mr. Hayes, what are your thoughts on being acquitted?" Marcus, finally able to breathe freely, answered simply, "I'm grateful. Justice was done, thanks to the truth." And to my daughter, reflection on the ordeal that evening, in the quiet of their modest apartment, Erica tucked Lily into bed. The day's events had left the family both exhausted and exhilarated. Marcus sat beside Erica, watching his daughter's chest rise and fall with each breath, marveling at how something so small had carried the weight of his freedom. "I can't believe it," he whispered. "All that fear, all those nights in jail, and she just spoke the truth." Erica nodded, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Sometimes it's the smallest voices that have the loudest impact." Lily saw what we adults overlooked. Marcus felt a profound humility. The trial had exposed flaws in the system, but it had also illuminated hope. That truth, even when fragile or unexpected, could prevail. Public reaction. The story dominated news cycles for days. Headlines read, "Toddler's words unravel drug case, and evidence mishandling exposes systemic flaws." Legal analysts debated the implications for future cases, law enforcement procedures, and the reliability of K-9 units. Social media celebrated Lily as a tiny hero, a symbol of unfiltered truth and the innocence that cuts through pretense. Marcus, however, remained grounded. He knew that freedom was just the beginning. His life, family, and community had been fractured by months of fear, uncertainty, and public scrutiny. But in that fractured world, hope had been restored. The family reunited. Days later, the family returned to their daily life, but nothing felt ordinary. The apartment seemed brighter. The small victories of cooking together, bedtime stories, and laughter took on monumental significance. Marcus had begun searching for work again, determined to rebuild. Erica resumed her studies, now fueled by the belief that justice and persistence could overcome even the most insurmountable obstacles. And Lily? She remained blissfully unaware of her role in history, happily playing with her blue backpack, her innocence a reminder that sometimes the smallest voices change the world. A lasting legacy. In the weeks that followed, the Hayes case was studied in law schools, cited in journals, and discussed in courtrooms as an example of procedural error and the importance of careful evidence handling. But to Marcus and Erica, the story was simpler, a tale of survival, of family, and of the truth prevailing in the most unexpected way. Marcus often thought about the day of the raid, the fear, the police dogs, the paperwork, the courtroom rituals. And he would always remember the 2 words that had turned everything upside down. Blue backpack. Those words had not only freed him, but had restored faith in the principle that even in a flawed system, truth, no matter how small or unexpected, could prevail. And in that restored faith, Marcus Hayes found not just freedom, but a reason to believe in hope again.